It is around 2150 BC, near Moala in Upper Egypt. You are kneeling inside a mud brick storeroom with one hand buried in a jar of emmer wheat. The grain is dry and warm. Dust sticks to the sweat on your wrist. Outside, the afternoon wind pushes sand across fields that should still smell of wet earth. The Nile rose this year, but not enough. Water entered the lowest basins and stopped. The high fields remained pale. The mud cracked before seed could be pressed into it. Now the grain beneath your fingers must do two jobs. It must become bread for the people in your house, and it must remain seed for a harvest that may never grow. If you grind too much, everyone eats now and plants less later. If you protect the seed, someone goes hungry tonight. You lift a measuring bowl. How much do you pour onto the grinding stone? There is no dam holding a national reserve of water upstream. No electric pump can pull irrigation water across a dry bank. There is no weather forecast, crop insurance, refrigerated truck, or international aid shipment. Grain is food, seed, rent, wages, tax, and savings at the same time. And the river is falling. The woman in this storeroom is a reconstruction. We do not know her name, the size of her household, or exactly what she chose. She stands in for millions of decisions that official inscriptions almost never recorded. Her tools are real. Her problem is real. But the surviving evidence belongs mostly to tomb walls, climate records, administrative documents, and the words of powerful men. Those sources leave us with several puzzles. A governor in Upper Egypt claimed that people crossed entire districts searching for barley. An Old Kingdom tomb shows women grinding, cleaning, and sifting flour with painful precision. A set of later household letters records rations being cut after a poor inundation, and a famous monument tells of 7 years when the Nile failed under King Djoser, even though that story was carved roughly 2,000 years after Djoser died. Which evidence describes a real crisis? Which part is political theater? And when royal government weakened, who actually kept people alive? By the end, the answer will lead back to the handful of grain in this woman's palm. The first myth to remove is the idea that the Nile worked like a perfect machine. Egypt is often called the gift of the Nile, and for good reason. But a gift is not the same thing as a guarantee. Some floods were generous, some were destructive, some rose too little to reach enough farmland. A sequence of weak floods could turn a manageable shortage into a crisis that outlasted every reserve. The second myth is hidden inside the title of this video. The Nile probably did not stop rising altogether across all of Egypt. Evidence points instead to periods of lower, irregular, or regionally uneven inundation around the end of the Old Kingdom and into the First Intermediate period. The flood never came describes how the disaster may have felt in a field that remained dry. It is not a literal measurement for the whole river. And the third myth is that one bad flood toppled the pyramids and ended the Old Kingdom overnight. Around 2200 BC, parts of northeastern Africa experienced intensified aridity during what researchers call the 4.2 kiloyear climate event. Sediments, ancient lake levels, wind-blown sand, and other environmental evidence suggest lower Nile levels and harsher conditions. But the dates are not precise enough to give us a single disaster year. Egypt was also facing political fragmentation, changing provincial power, and a weakening central administration. Climate applied pressure. Politics decided where that pressure broke the system. To understand the danger, you have to follow water far beyond Egypt. Most of the dramatic summer rise that ancient farmers depended on began with seasonal rain in the Ethiopian highlands. Water entered the Blue Nile and the Atbara, then traveled north into the main river. Egyptian farmers did not have a modern map of that system. They understood the flood through observation, administration, ritual, and gods such as Hapi and Khnum. When the river rose well, water entered networks of basins and channels. Earthen banks held it over fields long enough to wet the soil and deposit sediment. As the water withdrew, farmers sowed emmer wheat and barley into moist earth. The next harvest depended on the height, timing, and duration of that earlier flood. That delay is cruel. A low inundation does not empty the breadbasket on the same day. It reduces the land that can be planted. Months later, fewer stalks are cut. After that, granaries fill less deeply. The shortage arrives in stages. which means families can see it coming but cannot know how long it will last. A flood could also be too high. Water might damage homes, animals, dikes, or stored goods. Egyptian agriculture therefore depended on a narrow moving target, enough water, in the right places, for long enough, but not too much. When that target was missed, the first defense was storage. Ancient Egyptians built granaries at different scales. Households, estates, temples, and royal institutions could all hold grain. Emmer and barley were often stored with protective outer parts still attached, then processed as needed. The walls had to protect the contents from damp, pests, theft, and accidental germination. Every measure removed from storage reduced the buffer between one harvest and the next. This is why a granary was more than a pantry. It converted a good flood in the past into time during a bad flood in the future. But storage only works when grain can reach the hungry. A sealed room full of barley does nothing for a family denied access to it. In a centralized state, taxes and estate production could move food through administrative networks. When those networks weakened, local control became more important. One district might still possess grain while another faced empty jars. Survival depended not only on how much Egypt grew, but on who controlled the doors. Now look at what happened after a door opened, and grain entered a household. An Old Kingdom relief from the tomb chapel of Ramkai at Saqqara shows two female millers kneeling over hard grinding stones. Above them, other women clean and sift the flour. Nearby, a woman shields her face from the heat while tending bread molds. Men also appear in the bakery and brewery, crushing grain, mixing dough, heating molds, and working with vats. The scene is not a photograph of every Egyptian household. It was created for an elite tomb and presents an ordered world designed to continue forever. But it gives unusually specific evidence about food labor. Women were not simply standing near grain. They were performing the repeated steps that made it edible. Emmer was demanding. Its tough husk had to be loosened. Grain had to be pounded, cleaned, sifted, and ground. The miller knelt and pushed a handstone back and forth over a lower stone. Her shoulders drove forward, her back bent. The same movement repeated until kernels became flour. During a shortage, that labor did not disappear. It became more exact. A full jar allows generous scoops and failed loaves. A nearly empty jar makes every spill expensive. Flour trapped in a basket matters. A loaf burned in an oven matters. The person processing grain becomes the final manager of a resource counted by officials long before it reaches the hearth. Bread and beer carried much of the Egyptian diet. They shared grain and some stages of production, although the final processes differed. Beer could preserve and transform part of the harvest into a drink with nutritional value. It was not a magical replacement for clean water, and it did not create calories from nothing. Every jar began with grain that could no longer be planted. So the woman at the grinding stone is making more than dinner. She is deciding how fast stored time will run out. Then we meet a man named Anktifi. He was a provincial governor buried at Moala during the first intermediate period, after central royal power had fractured. The inscriptions in his tomb describe war, hunger, grain, and his own ability to rescue communities. He claimed that people from north and south came with their children, bringing oil to exchange for barley. He presented himself as the man who fed the hungry when other regions failed. The most extreme lines claim that all Upper Egypt was starving, and that hunger had driven people beyond the limits of ordinary human behavior. Those sentences are often repeated as if a reporter had interviewed survivors. That is not how the text works. Anktifi's tomb was a monument to Anktifi. Its purpose was to magnify his virtue, power, and right to rule. Egyptian elite autobiographies used formulas in which the tomb owner fed the hungry, clothed the naked, and rescued the weak. His description may preserve the memory of real scarcity, but every claim passes through self-promotion. The inscription therefore gives us two kinds of evidence. It suggests that famine and grain movement were politically meaningful in his world, and it shows that a local governor could build legitimacy by controlling food when the king at the center no longer appeared able to do so. That changes the story. So far, it sounds as if Egypt survived by waiting for a pharaoh to restore the sacred order of the river. The evidence points toward something less dramatic and more practical. Provincial stores, grain boats, exchange between districts, household reserves, and local patrons became the working parts of survival. The Old Kingdom's decline did not erase government. It changed the scale at which power operated. Local rulers grew stronger. Some organized irrigation, storage, taxation, transport, and defense within their own territories. People moved toward places where food was available. Grain traveled in the opposite direction when trade or political decisions allowed it. A family with relatives in another town, cloth to exchange, or access to an estate store had options that an isolated laborer did not. This is why drought alone cannot explain the crisis. If food exists 50 kilometers away but conflict blocks the boat, hunger is political. If a granary is full but a dependent has no recognized claim to its contents, hunger is social. If a governor releases grain only to allies, the height of the Nile is only one part of the disaster. One set of documents shows this mechanism at household scale, but it comes with an important date warning. The Heikanakht papyri were written in the early 12th dynasty, roughly 2 centuries after the end of the Old Kingdom and after Egypt had been reunited. They are not eyewitness accounts of the original crisis. They are valuable because they show how one Egyptian household later responded when an inundation was poor. Heikanakht managed agricultural property and sent letters to his family and dependents. In one, household members had complained of hunger after their grain allowances were reduced. He defended the decision by connecting available provisions to the size of the inundation. The preserved documents list distributions, salaries, debts, flax, and household disputes. This is survival written as arithmetic. Not everyone received the same amount. The household head controlled the calculation. Dependents could protest, but the person who owned or administered the grain decided what counted as enough to keep them working. A bad flood passed through a chain of authority before it reached the bowl. Women appear inside this documentary world as wives, mothers, workers, creditors, and recipients of grain. Egyptian women generally possessed legal capacities unusual to many later societies. They could own and transfer property, make contracts, and bring cases to court. In principle, a woman with land, stored grain, or linen possessed resources she could manage or exchange. In practice, legal capacity did not make wealth equal. Most women did not control estates. Poor women, servants, and dependents could be legally recognized people and still have little power over the granary. Heikanakht's own letter discusses the mistreatment of his wife inside a household whose resources he administered from a distance. That distinction matters. Rights can create options. They cannot fill an empty jar. Textile work offered another possible resource. Linen production was deeply embedded in Egyptian households and institutions, and women are prominent in surviving workshop scenes. Cloth could be stored, paid, inherited, or exchanged. In the Heikanakht records, flax, textiles, and grain belonged to the same world of calculation. When crops failed, a piece of linen represented hours of labor that might be converted into food. But if every neighbor was also trying to trade cloth for barley, its value depended on someone still having grain to sell. Now consider the most famous Egyptian famine story of all. On Sihel Island near Aswan, an inscription describes 7 years in which the Nile failed during the reign of King Djoser. The king seeks knowledge, honors the god Khnum, and receives a promise that the river will flow again. It sounds like the perfect ancient record of how Egypt survived a stopped Nile, but the monument known as the Famine Stela was carved in the late or Ptolemaic period, roughly 2,000 years after Djoser's reign. Its language deliberately looked backward. The story supported the religious and economic importance of Khnum's temple at Elephantine. The stela is ancient, but it is not contemporary with the event it describes. That does not make it worthless. It reveals how later Egyptians remembered famine as a breakdown in the relationship between king, temple, god, and river. It shows that the failure of the Nile remained one of the most powerful disasters the culture could imagine. What it cannot do is prove that a literal 7-year famine occurred under Djoser, or explain what ordinary families did around 2200 BC. For that, we return to less spectacular evidence. grinding women on a tomb wall, grain measured in letters, climate traces in old sediments, and governors boasting about barley. Together, these sources point to survival strategies without pretending that every household used all of them. People stored grain when floods were good. They reduced allowances when stores fell. They exchanged oil, cloth, labor, or other goods for food. They moved along the river toward better supplied districts. Local authorities redistributed grain, whether from generosity, obligation, or political ambition. Farmers maintained channels and tried to direct limited water toward land that could still produce. None of those solutions was reliable on its own. Storage could be exhausted. Exchange favored the person who still owned something valuable. Movement separated families and exposed travelers to conflict. Local protection could become local coercion. Rationing kept a group alive by deciding who would eat less, and scarcity did not enter every body equally. A pregnant woman, a nursing mother, a growing child, an elderly person, and a laborer performing heavy work did not have identical nutritional needs. Cutting every bowl by the same amount would not produce the same physical consequences. Yet ancient administrative lists tend to turn people into units of grain. They rarely tell us who became weak first, or whose share was quietly transferred to someone else. We should not romanticize the ingenuity of survival. The system that preserved one household might exclude another. Octafy's claim that no one died under his protection cannot be verified. His grain also strengthened his authority. Heconoc's careful accounts show organization, but they also show dependents complaining that they were hungry. Nor should we describe the entire First Intermediate period as a century of uniform darkness. Conditions varied by region and decade. Some provincial centers gained wealth and cultural influence as royal power weakened. Local tombs and new forms of religious expression expanded. Egypt did not vanish when the Old Kingdom ended. Communities reorganized, competed, adapted, and eventually became part of a reunified state. The crisis was real. The simple collapse story is not. 3 conclusions remain. First, the Nile did not need to disappear to create famine. A smaller flood meant less planted land, a smaller harvest, thinner stores, and greater vulnerability to the next poor year. Second, food shortage became famine when access failed. Granaries, boats, local alliances, household status, and political control determined whether grain moved toward hungry people or remained behind a door. Third, the labor that turned grain into survival was often ordinary and female. Grinding, cleaning, baking, brewing, measuring, storing, weaving, and negotiating did not command armies or raise pyramids. But without those tasks, no governor's barley could become tomorrow's meal. Return to the storeroom near Moala. The woman still holds the measuring bowl. The river outside is low. She cannot change the rain in Ethiopia, repair the royal government, or know whether next year's flood will be better. She can make one decision. She pours a smaller measure onto the grinding stone. The rest falls back into the jar. Some is food, some is seed. Some may be traded if the household can find a boat, a storehouse, or a relative with grain to spare. The sound of stone on grain begins again. It is not the sound of a civilization collapsing. It is the sound of someone trying to make a civilization last one more day. Would you eat the seed grain now, or save it for a flood that may not come? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe to keep exploring the hidden lives of ancient women.